The following program is a Town of Colonie television production of the William K. Sanford Town Library.
It goes all my life's a circle, sunrise and sundown. The moon rolls through the nighttime till the daybreak comes around. And all my life's a circle, but I can't tell you why. Seasons spinning round again, the years keep rolling by.
I'll tell you a story about, and it's called Hemball Salve, and it was collected by Vaughn Ward, who's a wonderful folklorist, and she has it in one of her books, which is called Harvey Carr, Harvey Carr, Harvey Carr. Well, you know, in the old days, they didn't have a drugstore on every corner. In fact, a lot of small towns didn't have any kind of a drugstore at all. So people made their own medicaments and lotions and potions. My mother used to make poultices. She'd take some used cloth of some sort, and she'd make a mixture of flour and lard, and then she'd put in some kind of an irritant, like hot mustard or ground ginger or something like that. And then she'd put it between those two pieces of cloth and slap it on whatever hurt. And you'd pretend that you were well because you didn't want that anywhere near you. And so people thought that the poultices were doing the work. But actually, whoo-wee. And my father-in-law was a country doctor, and he was famous for a cough syrup that he made on the kitchen stove. He had a special pot for it, and he put in all the different things, and he'd stir it with a stick, and he called it croupies. And people would come, even after he retired, people would knock on the door and say, "Can I get some of that croupies?" Well, Harvey Carr, up in the mountains, decided that he wanted some salve. Now, if he lived down in the city, he probably would have bought the salve from a Boy Scout who was selling cloverine salve in a little tin container, and they came door to door to door to sell the cloverine salve. But he was up in the mountains and he was on his own. So he had a bucket and he went out in the woods and he got the inside bark of a hemlock tree. And then he saw a stand of balsam, and they each had globules. They were sticky and they were fragrant. So he took a bunch of those globules and put it in a bucket with the bark that he already had in there, and then he put in some herbs and stuff, and he took it home and he put it on the stove, put water in and some spices, and he had a sturdy stick, and he put it on the back burner and let it cook gently for 2 or 3 days, and he'd give it a stir every now and then when he pronounced it ready, he put it in a crock. Well, he went out to chop his wood, and he's going with an axe, and it went right into his leg, and oh, it hurt like a son of a gun. Oh, and he went in, and he got some of the Hemball salve, hem from hemlock and ball from balsam, and he put it on there and rubbed it. Instantaneous cure. Well, he was using it for everything that was broken, from broken wood things, to broken windows, to broken bones, all kinds of things. He just thought that was wonderful stuff. So it was, getting along in the fall, and a time to get his wood in for the winter, and he's out there chopping and chopping and chopping, and his dog came along, Spot. And Spot thought it was some new kind of a game, and he's running around, and Harvey's chopping and chopping. He said, "Get out, Spot, get, you're going to get hurt, get." He chopped down and chopped Spot's tail right off. Oh, Harvey cried. Oh, he wouldn't have hurt that dog for the world. He loved Spot so. And Spot was yelping and yelling, and so Harvey picked him up, carried him in the house, and laid him on the kitchen table, and went and got some of that Hemball salve and put it on the stump, and he rubbed and he rubbed and he rubbed and he rubbed and he rubbed, and he rubbed a new tail. It was a beautiful tail, came right up over the back of Spot. Oh, he never looked better. Well, the winter came, and it was a long, hard winter, the way winters are apt to be up in the North Country. And at the first sign of spring, Harvey went out to clean up the mess in the yard. He had wood chips and sawdust and all kinds of stuff. And he had his broom, and he's sweeping and sweeping and sweeping. And he looked down and he saw something, and he couldn't figure out what it was. It looked like something from maybe an animal. Or he kicked at it, and he kicked at it, and he looked again, and he finally kicked at it, got it up out of the frost. It was what was left of Spot's tail. So he brought it in the house and he laid it on the table, and he got the hemball salve and he rubbed it and he rubbed it and he rubbed it and he turned it over and he rubbed it and he rubbed it and he rubbed it, and he rubbed a new dog. And it was a beautiful dog, just as good looking as Spot and just as nice a dog.
I found this story of King Solomon. One day, King Solomon called his advisors all together and said, I have this problem. When life is good, I can never enjoy it because I'm always worrying when this good period will end. And when times are bad, I'm sure they will never end. But I had a dream last night that there is a ring that will help me. I would like you to find this ring and bring it to me within 6 months. So his advisors all agreed, and they went off, but they couldn't find anything. And then they asked, the caravans who were coming into the city, and they had nothing to offer. But they said they would ask, and they waited for the caravans to come back again, and nothing. It was the night before the time to King Solomon's deadline, when the youngest counselor still said, well, I'll search the city one more time. And he searched all through the night. As dawn was coming up, there was, in a poor section of town he really hadn't been in before, he saw a jeweler setting up his little stand in front of his hovel, really. He didn't think it would help, but he said, I have a problem. King Solomon is looking for a ring. Told the jeweler his story, and the jeweler said, I can help you. And he went into his hovel, came back with a ring, not of gold, not of silver. Who knows what metal it was made out of. But he took that ring, and inside of it he inscribed something. And then he gave it to the counselor, who looked and said, yes, this is it. Thank you so much. And he gave the jeweler all the money he had. So when the king was conducting his committee meeting that day, he asked, have any of you found the ring I seek? And they all pushed the young counselor forward. He said, yes, sire, I have. And he gave the ring to King Solomon. And King Solomon, looked at this base metal ring, but he looked inside, and there were the 3 Hebrew letters that stand for the phrase, this too shall pass. And the king went, yes, this is just what I needed. That during the happy times, I will remember this too shall pass, but I don't have to worry about when. And during the sad times, this will give me comfort that this too shall pass and that they will end. So the king took off one of his precious rings and gave it to the young counselor with his thanks, and put on this base metal ring and wore it for the rest of his days. And that ring gave him much comfort during the good times and the bad.
This is a story that sort of quickly and accidentally came into my life when I got invited, as you were saying, to those gigs that the Catholic pastoral people are now inviting me to. A particular group called the Ladies of Charity invited me to find 4 Catholic women and tell their stories. I did do that, and it was going to be at the Ladies of Charity place. But right at the last minute, they called me and said, we are going to need to move our event to the Sisters of Mercy in Albany because we're having a funeral that morning for one of our sisters, and some of our lay women will come, but we probably won't be there, but the Sisters of Mercy in Albany. And as it turned out, one of the women I'd been working on was Catherine McCauley. So I'll tell you a little bit about Catherine McCauley, who was the founder of the Sisters
Of Mercy. Oh,
And when I went into the chapel to do the stories, there was Catherine's face in a big portrait in the chapel looking right at me like, tell it well, girl.
oh, get it straight.
What I loved finding out first about Catherine was that at 4 years old, her father, who was a Catholic in the time that the penal laws were still in effect, although they were getting ready to change. Of course, it was going to take a while to change people's opinions, a long while, but her father was a brilliant architect and a maker of wooden things, pulpits, but churches that he'd built pulpits for were closed, and things like that. But he had the respect of the Protestant people, what they called the ascendancy, where the Protestants had money and, ran the country. But he was among them because he had this wonderful work ethic, and he was an artist, and he was also really a real estate agent, kind of, trying to help people get housing. But he had a great love for the poor. So on Saturday mornings, he and little Catherine, really just maybe 4 years old, would walk into Dublin, and they'd go to the poorest sections. And he'd give Catherine pockets full of little treats that she could give out to the children. And he would invite families, if you'd like to on Sunday, we have a little service at our house right in the yard. It's kind of like a Catholic service. And I know many of you, come from Catholic roots. We don't have a priest doing it, but it's really lovely. And if you'd like to come and hear stories about Jesus or tell some stories yourself, come to our house. We'll come down with a big cart on Sunday mornings and pick up anybody who'd like to go. And he would point to his daughter Catherine and say, and Catherine's my helper. She gives out the buns and pours the buttermilk. So every Sunday morning, this little girl is watching her father orchestrate a You're Welcome If You're Catholic event. And the poor people would come and feed them. And she really got inducted into the art of charity. Now, not long after that, when she wasn't much more than 4, her father had a heart attack and died. Her mother, who had loved being part of this ascendancy, but had been practicing Catholic with her husband as much as possible, said, we're not going to be Catholic anymore. Our friends are Protestant. We're going to join the Church of England, and that's that. But Catherine was the oldest of the little ones, and the little ones were easily, brought, whatever their mother says goes. And Catherine said, I'm not so sure I want to join. I'll come with you, Mommy, but I'm not joining. And as she got older and older, she found a couple of other Catholic friends that were relatives of her father or mother, cousins. And she went and lived with them so she could kind of be more with the Catholic spirit. And it wasn't an easy life because they were suffering in some ways financially, and one of the adults was having a drink problem, and that was a big problem in Ireland, of course. And she just hung in. And as she got to be a teenager, her mother was not well. And she cared for her mother just with all her heart and soul. And her mother actually died in her arms as a teenage girl. And she felt in her heart, because you can get inducted into the mystery of God in ways that aren't necessarily true, I think, but that her mother might go to hell because she had made that decision. So she was determined that she would help bring her siblings back into the church, and she was going to talk about being Catholic. And like I said, the penal laws were kind of coming to an end, so it was okay to talk about it. And she wanted to be of help in any way she could. A couple that were part of her parents' friends were Quaker, and they had come back from being in India for a long time. They were perhaps English, but they might have been Irish and wanted to come back to Ireland. And they were elderly and asked, "You took such beautiful care of your mother, and we see that you're a young girl who's cares for the poor, and if you have a little extra food, you'll give it to somebody or help somebody out." And Catherine was also very big at watching out for young women who worked for the rich and could sometimes be taken advantage of, and she had that as a cause. Well, the couple said, "You could come and live with us, and you could help take care of us as we're aging, and we would pay you a good salary, and we just would love to have you around. Now, we don't want you kneeling in front of crosses or anything like that. We're Quaker, we're not doing that." But Catherine it's perfectly fine. And the woman said, "And if you want to let in a beggar or two in the back door to have a little food, that would be all right, but not too many." And so she made this wonderful relationship with this Quaker couple. And they did indeed get elderly, and they both converted right near their deaths to Catholicism because of all that Catherine talked about. And she would bring a priest friend to talk with them about the church. And not everybody believes in converting people at the last minute, but it was something that was very important to her. And a lot of the couple's relatives were nervous that the money inheritance might go to Catherine. And one day, when the father was ill and she was caring for him, but he was sitting up in the living room and the window was open, he heard one of the relatives say, "That Catholic girl, she's going to get his money and we're going to lose out on everything." And he called over Catherine and he said, "I've made my decision that I would like you to take our inheritance, our entire inheritance, Catherine. If you had something you wanted to do with this money, what would it be?" She said, "I would like to start a home for women, and it would be young women who need a place of lodging because they don't have it or because they need to get away from some circumstances that are bad. I'd also like to have children be able to come if the women have children. And with this amount of money, we could build a beautiful, established house of mercy." And while the Catholic priest gave her a little trouble, you can't just have all those women living together and no one chaperoning them. "So we're going to have you go train to be a nun." And Catherine really had no intention. She was about 40 at this point. No intention of becoming a nun, but all right, I'll get the training. And so she said, "I'm not going to join that convent, but we'll be called the Women of Mercy. We'll be called the Sisters of Mercy." And so it began at Baggot Street. And you can still go to Baggot Street in Dublin. And you can read all the stories of what Catherine's life was like growing up. I have a new friend who's a Sister of Mercy that I've just made recently, and she's been handing me lots of books about Catherine, like A Woman Sings of Mercy. She said, "Marni, you're going to tell her story. Keep reading about it." So I'm very grateful for that. She's actually working with the Dominican nuns in Schenectady. The nuns today all have to get gigs, just like the storytellers. And I just have such a fondness for her, and the fact that in Albany, near where we are right now, we're in Colonie and Schenectady's not far, the Sisters of Mercy have developed hospitals and schools and nursing homes, and their legacy in this area is very, very strong. But it was a long time coming with Catherine learning to be the head of an order of nuns when she never imagined herself a nun to begin with. But I guess you'd say she married Jesus and was happy to do so. And that's a little bit about Catherine McCauley.
So this is called used nails. Well, we were fixing up an old house that my grandpa Jesse had made, and when we came to a layer of shakes, that's what they used to call them in the old days, shingles, and they were handmade out of cedar. And I picked up one, and it looked kind of funny because it looked as if a nail had been driven in and then pulled out again. And I thought, that's my Grandpa Jesse and his habit of saving things. Now my Grandpa Jesse saved everything. He saved piles of old newspaper. He had bags of rags. He had a great big ball of string. He also had a box, and it was labeled "string too short to be saved." He saved anything that had any possible use. He went around in a disreputable old jacket and had holes all over, and some of the holes were from his habit of smoking a pipe. And when he had enough tobacco, he'd stick that pipe still lit in his pocket. And every now and then I'd have to say, "Grandpa, you're on fire!" And then he'd put out the fire with his hands. Well, everybody knew that he was a saver. And Ray Ormsby up at Lake Desolation was fixing up an old camp up there. And he had a lot of old cedar shakes. And he was going to give them away free. First come, first serve. And he sent one of Daniel's boys down to tell Grandpa. Well, Grandpa heard about it kind of late in the day, and he was all for going right then. But Grandma said, "No, Jesse, you've worked hard all day. You're tired. You can't get up there before sundown anyway. So sit in and have your supper, and then if you want to go up, okay." So he wolfed down his supper, and then he went out and he hitched up his horses, and he put 2 lanterns on the front. Now, Grandpa always had the best horses. Some people don't care if the back of the horse makes a letter U, but Grandpa had wonderful horses. And that was an advantage when he went in to get his wood in the fall, too, because most people had to look for a nice straight tree so that they could easily get it out of the woods. Didn't bother Grandpa. He'd take any old which-way tree, put it on the ground, and he'd put one horse on the top and one horse on the bottom and just pull it on straight. And then he could carry it right out of the woods. So he went up the lake. Now, anybody that knows Lake Desolation knows that Lake Desolation Road is 10 miles straight up. And but the horses were up for the task, and they got up there, and they got up to Ray Ormsby's camp quite late in the night. And but there was a little frost up there, even though it was midsummer. It gets cold up there, and so that invigorated Grandpa. And he jumped down, and he was so thrilled to see Ray Ormsby had put those shakes in neat piles on the ground, not helter-skelter all over the front yard the way some folks would. So he got down and he began to put the shakes up on the rig. And then he saw that there was something else on the ground, and he couldn't quite see. Now, there was a big full moon, and they had the lanterns and all, but he still couldn't quite see. So he got out a pair of glasses, and he would have been able to see perfectly if they'd been the right prescription, but they were a pair that had been willed to him by his Uncle Frank. And he put them on. It was a little like walking underwater, don't you know? And so he looked down, and he said, "Oh, those are the used nails." Now, Grandpa loved nothing better than used nails. It could be an old brown, squiggly old thing all bent out of shape. He could pick it up, and with one blow of his hammer, straighten it out. He could use it over and over and over again. Oh, he was so pleased. So when he got all the shakes up there, he gathered up all those used nails, and he put it in his pockets. And then he got up. Now the horses had been asleep all this time, so they were full of beans. And they came down that Lake Desolation, lickety-cut, and right up across the front lawn. Well, it was all right, because by that time the frost was down in the valley too. And he came up next to the south side, and he said, "Boy, I feel pretty good. That little frost has invigorated me, and I've got those shakes, and I've got those nails. Well, I guess I'll start right now." So he picked up one of the shakes, and he where are the nails? Looked in all his pockets. Where are the nails? Could put on those crazy glasses again, and he looked. Oh, they're all over the ground. They must have come through those holes in his jacket. So he picked up a nail, got it straightened out, and another nail. Put it all on the south side. Worked all night. Straightened a nail, put it up. Beautiful job. But it was getting toward dawn, and he was getting a little tired and a little hungry, too. Now, Grandma knew he'd be coming in because she heard all this hammering and banging all night long. And so she was in the kitchen. She had the fire going and the coffee on, and the breakfast started. And so he came in, and he says, I'd like a little breakfast. And she said, your usual? Of course. So he had about a gallon of coffee and 5 pounds of bacon and a gross of pancakes and enough syrup to float a cow. Now, the Bowmans have always been known for their love of syrup. And they talk about Uncle Forrest Bowman, who had pancakes and syrup every morning of his life. He had a full-face beard, and he'd never use a napkin. But they'd take it off in the spring and boil it down and get 2 quarts of good syrup. So Grandpa sat in, and he ate his pancakes, and he said to Grandma, why don't you go out and see what I done? She said, well, I think I will. She put her shawl on, she went out, and she wasn't out there but a minute. She came back in, she said, well, those shakes aren't half bad. Why don't you put them up? What? What do you think I've been doing all night long? I've got the south side half done. Not so she could notice it, she said. I don't know what you're talking about, woman. Oh, he was so mad. He stormed out, and he looked. His heart was broken. Helter-skelter all over the front lawn were those shakes. Only one shake still on the side of the house, and that was held by one nail. And there was something peculiar about that nail, too, because it was going from the east to the west, to the east to the west. And he's looking at it, and finally it came out and went down on the ground and slithered off into a hole. And that's when Grandpa knew what he had done. He had shingled that house with nothing but frozen earthworms. It's the truth.
The gift of hope is sometimes the most important gift of all. There were many, thousands and thousands of contraptions like this created. And they were all created because of a conversation U.S. Air Force pilot Gail Halvorson had with children in West Berlin in July of 1948. One of the children, a group of 30, a girl of 12 with wistful blue eyes wearing oversized trousers, said, "We could exist with very little if we knew that the Western Allies would stay with us and do their best." Clearly there was a disaster going on, but it wasn't a natural disaster. No, it was a human-made disaster. In June of 1948, the month earlier, the Soviets decided they wanted control of all of Berlin. At the end of World War II, they had been given control of a part of it, but they wanted all of it. And they decided to use a siege, a blockade, to force West Berlin to join them. And so they blocked the road access, the railway access, and the river access to West Berlin, which is in the middle of what was then East Germany. So it was a little island in the middle of East Germany that had no way to have goods shipped in. The only way that was left was by the air. Again, at the end of World War II, the negotiation was that there would be 3 flight paths open to the Allies to access West Berlin. Well, air access West Berlin had 2.2 million people in it in 1948. It was estimated they were going to need 4,500 tons, 4,500 tons per day to survive of food and supplies. And this was at a time when cargo planes each carried less than 10 tons. So I've done the math. We're talking suddenly at least 500 flights were going to be needed a day to keep the West Berliners alive and with heat in their homes, because most of the heat then was generated by coal. Well, the Allies said they would take on the task. And it had started up when this conversation took place in July of 1948. Gale Halvorson had landed his plane, and it takes time to unload almost 10 tons of material off of a plane. So he had some time to kill, and he noticed some children over by the mesh fence. And so he went over to talk to them. He had been in World War II and talked to children wherever he had been stationed. And one of them said, "How many bags of flour can you fit in your plane?" And they discussed that. And how many loaves of bread can be made from each bag of flour? And then another child said, "You know, my relatives from East Berlin come to West Berlin every day to go to the library to read the newspapers published in West Berlin, because they're very different than the newspapers published in East Berlin. They find out a lot more from the newspapers published in West Berlin." And then that girl with the wistful blue eyes, with the oversized trousers, said, "We could exist with very little." So he spoke to them for about an hour, but then he had to get back because he was doing 3 flights a day from West Germany into West Berlin. And after he said goodbye, he was walking away, but he thought, there's something really different about this conversation. Well, yes, I know the topic was different, that most children, these were adult topics these children were all talking about, but most of them had lived through World War II, so they really hadn't been children for a long time. But there's something else. They didn't ask me for candy. Every place I've been before, they've always asked me for candy. I hadn't planned to see them. Oh. So he searched in his pockets and came up with 2 sticks of gum. So he turned around and went back and said, I want to share some candy with you, but I only have 2 sticks of gum. And he passed it through the fence. And they carefully broke it up into, well, less than 30 pieces. Excuse me, gum can only be broken up so far. But the children who didn't get any of the gum wanted pieces of the wrappers, and they enjoyed them and carefully tucked them away for future enjoyment. And he watched all this. Gale Halvorson, the pilot, watched all this and said, "Tomorrow I'm going to drop some candy out of my plane for you when I'm landing in one of my flights." And there was a buzz of conversation in German, and that girl with the wistful blue eyes and oversized trousers said, "What plane will you be flying?" "Oh, I don't know. I fly a different plane every day." Buzz of conversation. "Well, it will be difficult for us to spot a little package. We need to know what plane." So he thought and said, "Oh, I'll wiggle my wings at you." And there was another buzz of conversation. "What is wiggle?" And he went, "Ah." And they went, "Wiggle, yeah, jawohl, wiggle." And so with that, he turned and went back. He told his other 2 crew members what had happened, and when they got back to their base, they pooled together all their rations, went to the PX, and bought enough Hershey bars to really damage a kid coming down. And so they decided they had to break it up into 3 piles, and they made these mini parachutes to hopefully break the fall. So their first flight in the next day, there were no children gathered, so the packages didn't go out. The next flight, though, there was a group there. So one of the crew members pushed them out as they were landing. The crew couldn't see what had happened because, they were landing. But as they were leaving several hours later, they saw the children wiggling the parachutes at all the planes that were leaving. Well, Gail Halverson and his crew kept up this, became known as candy bombing, which sounds a little damaging, but first unofficially, and then when they were discovered officially. And then they got support from this country, candy manufacturers, children, like the children in Chicopee, Massachusetts, made 40,000 parachutes like this. And then they were tying just one Hershey bar to it, not a whole ton of them. The blockade continued for 15 months. The Allies worked up to an average of 600 flights a day. The Soviets eventually gave up. The Allies looked like they could do this forever. The Allies had brought in 2.3 million tons. So I can't really get my head around that. Million tons is so. Gail got a number of thank you letters. One started out, Lieber Schokoladenflieger, Dear Chocolate Flyer, which I thought was a better expression than candy bomber. And it said, thank you so much for your sweet treats. The youngest of us had never had any chocolate. For them, it was just a dream. Chocolate is available in our shops, but don't ask the cost. Our parents can't scrape together enough money to spend on something like chocolate. As much as we were afraid of the American planes during the war, are we thankful to see them today as they are bringing the food we need to eat. There was a 50th anniversary of the candy bomber with some of the children who had received these gifts. One of them told Gail Halverson, this came out of a cloud, it surprised me, but it wasn't the chocolate. This proved that someone outside our blockaded city knew of my problems. It wasn't the chocolate, it was hope. Sometimes the most important gift is the gift of hope.
It goes all my life's a circle, sunrise and sundown. The moon rolls through the nighttime till the daybreak comes around. And all my life's a circle, I can't tell you why. Seasons spinning